It's Alabama Annie with part 14 of the Starlight Tavern, one of my books available on Kindle. It was the Saturday morning before the Christmas play at church when Aunt Mary woke me bright and early. She rushed into my room and told me to get up and get dressed and pulled an outfit and my shoes from the closet. Hurry now, we're going to ride to Chattanooga. We're going to go and see Santa and then go out to lunch and do some Christmas shopping, she announced. That all sounded like great fun to me, so I washed my hands and face, I combed my hair, I brushed my teeth and put on my clothes and shoes and pulled on my new red coat because it was pretty chilly that morning. I rushed out to the kitchen and ate a piece of toast and a glass of milk that Hattie had handed me. I hope you have a wonderful time, Maggie, she said, just as my aunt called me from the parlor, and I ran through to her. We stepped out the door onto the porch as I looked for Mr. Harvey and the car, but instead there was another car parked and waiting for us at the end of the walkway, and someone was sitting behind the wheel. My aunt took my hand and led me down the steps toward the car. I peered at it and at the driver and asked, "Where's Mr. Harvey?" But she shook her head. She opened the door to the back seat of the car and told me to get in. "Today," she announced, "we're going with Uncle Albert." She closed the door behind me and raced around to the front passenger side and got in before I could say a single word. Albert turned around and smiled at me. "Why, good morning, Miss Maggie," he said. "Are you ready to go and see Santa? We're going to have a wonderful time today." He winked at me, and I gave him the meanest look I could muster and shook my head. I'd never been one to buck authority, but I didn't want to go with them. I didn't want to go anywhere with them right then because I was still mad at my Aunt Mary. "I don't want to go to Chattanooga with you or Albert. I want to stay here," I told Aunt Mary. I leaned forward in the seat, but she whipped her head around and pointed a finger at me and said, "That's enough, young lady. Sit back and be quiet." And without another word, Albert drove us off the mountain. When he looked at me in the rearview mirror, he looked as mad as a snake, and I made a face at him. Aunt Mary tried to make the best of the situation, chatting away about this and that and making jokes and pointing out pretty places along the way as we drove along. And old Albert even tried his hand at lightening the mood by telling me that if I was good, when we got to town, after I'd seen Santa, that I could pick out a brand new toy for myself. "You can get anything you'd like," he said, as my aunt glanced back with a look of approval and a smile. At first, I didn't say or do anything, but then it sunk in. I could get another doll or even a Monopoly game. I can get anything I asked just to reassure myself that I'd heard what I thought I did. He said, "Yes, anything." I looked out the window and smiled. This trip might not be so bad after all, I thought. At the crowded department store, there was Christmas music playing over a speaker, and the air smelled like cinnamon and spice, and I could hear jingle bells. Inside the door, Aunt Mary paused, pulling a folded piece of paper from her purse. It was her shopping list. She looked down at me and said, "Now, Maggie, I have some shopping to do, and I want you to go with Uncle Albert and get in line for Santa." I reluctantly took his hand when he offered it, and we parted ways with Aunt Mary, who rushed off into the crowd and disappeared. "Let's go," Albert said, walking me down the center aisle of the store to the waiting line for Santa. The line was very long. There must have been at least 30 children ahead of me, but teenage workers dressed as Santa's elves were passing out cookies and treats, so I got in line. Albert moved over to one side behind a velvet rope with the other grown-ups, and I stood there behind a girl with glasses and long blonde hair. An elf offered us cookies from her platter, and we took them. The elf asked us if we had been naughty or nice. We both said nice, and the line moved slowly along. It got so crowded, though, I lost sight of Albert after a time, and the grown-ups behind the rope but I knew he was there somewhere. Finally, after 3 more cookies and a candy cane, it was my turn to march up the snow-covered steps to Santa. Santa motioned for me to come up, and I only hesitated a moment before he snatched me onto his knee. He peered over his glasses at me. "And what is your name, little girl?" he asked with a chuckle, and I told him it was Maggie. "And have you been good this year?" he asked, and I said that I had for the most part, but that I missed my mama, and I told him she had died. Santa got quiet when I said that. He looked very, very sorry at me and said he knew I missed her very much. And then I blurted out, "My Aunt Mary has a new boyfriend and I don't like him very much, but he says I can pick out a toy today if I'd like." Santa nodded his head. He said that was very generous and that her boyfriend must like me to do something like that. The bell on the end of his hat jingled as he talked. "Well, I know you love your aunt and I know you miss your mama, and maybe you'll learn to like the boyfriend too," he suggested. "You always have to look for the best in people," he told me. I hadn't looked through the big toy catalog at home yet, so I hadn't really made up my mind about what I wanted Santa to bring me, but then when he asked, it came to me. Last year, before Mama had passed away, I thought about asking for a Betsy McCall doll and her playhouse, but I never did, and I still wanted them. I could just see that dollhouse and that doll sitting in the floor of my room. I wanted a Betsy McCall doll. He asked me if I would be sure to take good care of them, and I said I would. Then Santa reached into his coat pocket and handed me a little silver bag with candy inside. He sat me down again and winked. "I'll see you Christmas Eve," he called as I started walking down the steps, and he pulled the next little kid up onto his knee. And with that, I moved down the aisle, past the elves, looking for Albert and the crowd of people behind the rope, but I didn't see him. I stood there for a while, waiting and looking, before I did spy him a couple of aisles over at a display counter. The clerk was behind the counter helping another customer, and Albert was standing close beside a woman with a beautiful coat with a fur collar. She looked very elegant. Her light brown hair was done up on top of her head, and she had a dangly bracelet on her arm and wore a pair of high heels. They were talking, leaning in toward one another against the counter, and I wondered who she was as I moved up behind them through the people trying to get closer. I could hear the woman talking. "How much longer are you going to keep up this charade with that woman?" she said. "I can't wait forever, you know, Albert." And he said, "Millie, you know Mary's just an old friend." He rubbed the back of her hand. "Well, old friend or not," she said, "you need to make up your mind. It's either Mary or me," she said, with her face only inches from his, as if they might kiss. But as I moved up behind Albert and tugged on his coat sleeve, he turned with a start, looking down at me, as the pretty woman gave me a quick smile and then moved away from him around the counter without a backward glance. Albert watched her go and then smiled down at me. He leaned down and asked, "Okay, did you tell Santa what you wanted?" And I nodded my head yes that I had, still watching that lady. "I told him I wanted a Betsy McCall doll and a playhouse," I said. "Who was that lady you were talking to?" I asked. "Oh," Albert said, "she's just an old friend I ran into." And without another word, he led me off toward the toy department, and I pretty much forgot about the whole thing for the moment. "Let's go find you something," he said as we roamed the aisles. There was so much to see, I knew I would never make up my mind. I looked through the dolls, but knew Santa was bringing me Betsy McCall, so I moved on to the games. I thought about Lincoln Logs, and I did grab a pair of pickup sticks. I looked at the roller skates, but there was really no place for me to use them at the tavern, and then I remembered I'd wanted that Monopoly game, so I found them and grabbed one up. I picked up the big white box and proudly announced that the game was what I'd chosen, and Albert seemed really pleased. I always like to use the top hat, he announced as we moved out of the toy section for the crowded aisle. Okay, let's go and find your Aunt Mary, he said. We found her at the perfume counter. She had a big shopping bag filled with things already, but said I needed to help her choose gifts for Lenny, Mr. John, Charlie, and Hattie, and Miss Martha. You can choose something for me and for Albert as well, if you'd like, she announced, saying that she wouldn't peek. So she and Albert followed me up and down the aisles until I found the gloves section. I chose gloves for Mr. Charlie, he was our postman, and gloves for Mr. Harvey and John because I knew they'd need some, and I picked a scarf out for William Post. And in the women's department, I found a beautiful rose-colored bathrobe with matching slippers and said I'd like to get that for Miss Hattie. And I found a scarf and cap set for Miss Martha. Back in the toy department again, I found a set of cars. There were 4 of them, a red one, a yellow one, a blue one, and a green one that I chose for Lenny. Then along another aisle, I found a keychain. I chose that for Albert. And for Aunt Mary, I chose a bottle of perfume that smelled like wildflowers for a change. It wasn't stinky like the other stuff she wore on a regular basis that made me sneeze. With my gifts safely tucked into the shopping bag, we moved out the door into the parking lot again, and I got into the car with them. Albert stored our shopping bags away in the trunk while Aunt Mary and I got settled as she turned to me and said, "Now we're going to have lunch. What would you like?" I thought for a moment about fried chicken or a big hamburger with fries and a chocolate malt, and I decided on that as Albert drove us along the busy streets and turned into the Lookout Diner.